So what we want to do here is take the presentation to the next level and look at OTT in terms of where it came from and where we see it going into the future. We started to enjoy entertainment centuries before in terms of live theater. Modern entertainment started to come to the cinema, and we would just enjoy entertainment from a viewing perspective. With vinyl records and VHS tapes, had the ability to start to own this video. So we had millions of copies being sold. People could have their own copy of music and so on, and that was brought to their home. And then eventually in the 90s, we had the ability and the computing power to start to digitize that content and put it onto our computers. That brings us to this last decade, where we started to realize that we can start to move all of this content that's sitting on our computers and put it into the cloud. So a lot of these cloud-based services that I mentioned earlier allowed us to bring it to the cloud and leave it there, so we didn't have to buy any of this hard drive space in order to store all of our videos and music and other types of content. We just put it in the cloud and work off the basis that the provider is protecting our content. The reality from an entertainment perspective is that we still have millions of copies of that content in the cloud. So everybody that bought that movie that had a copy on their computer and moved to the cloud has now the exact same copy of that movie duplicated millions of times. So we're moving to a model where why should we have millions of copies of the same content in the cloud? Why don't we just have one and let everybody just access that one instance of that content, right? It makes sense. Now that it's in the cloud, there's no reason why all of us should have the same Game of Thrones copy stored in the cloud. So we're moving from this viewing perspective of entertainment to ownership in the last century and in the last decade, realizing that we don't actually need to own any of this entertainment. We just have to have the ability to license it. When we look at it from the basic perspective that we buy these DVDs and we buy these Blu-rays, how many times do we watch that disc, right? We watch it maybe once, twice, we maybe give it to a friend to watch, but generally speaking, and of course we listen to music much more than movies, the amount of usage of that disc completely wasted. But if we move it to the cloud, then the manufacturers don't have to print the disc, create the plastic around, and all the marketing. So the cost of manufacturing is gone, and we just have a single copy in the cloud. Once it's in the cloud, then it's primed for the center of where OTT sits as a service. Generating revenue from an entertainment perspective is a good question, and the entertainment industry definitely is trying to sort out how best to monetize their libraries. On one side, the entertainment industry basically can bypass the entire classic supply chain by not, as I mentioned, not having to print labels, not having to print the discs, not having to print the packaging, and just giving a digital copy to a service provider to deliver online. There's no easy answer in terms of addressing the monetization issue, because these are all discussions that are being done right now. Obviously, when we own something, we're paying much more versus subscribing to it through an OTT service, paying much less. How this all kind of plays out in the future will be driven, I think, a lot by the user behavior. And one thing is clear from the music industry, nobody wants to repeat what happened in the music industry. The music industry, generally speaking, is around maybe $20 billion. What happened in the music industry is that when the CD came out, there was no encryption whatsoever. And over the years, people realized that they can rip those discs onto their computers and then have a copy on their computer. The movie industry saw that and realized, okay, we need to not repeat the mistakes of the music industry. We have to encrypt our content. So when they did their DVD, then there was encryption, and then there was much stronger encryption for Blu-ray, and that was eventually broken as well. But generally speaking, the movie industry is realizing that the physical sales of music is in decline. The online revenue is increasing for music, let's say through iTunes and so on, but it's not compensating for the decline in physical sales. And the movie industry does not want to repeat that same dynamic in their industry. Holding on to that content and making sure it's monetized in the best way possible is something that is constantly in the back of the minds of these content owners. To put things into perspective, 90% of American premium content, okay, premium content is top movies, the top catalogs in terms of TV and so on. 90% of the premium content in the US is worth $45 billion per year. And they're owned by 9 companies. We have Disney, we have Sony, we have Time Warner, there is AMC, and several others that own this $45 billion pot. And companies that want to license that premium content from Hollywood need to pay a part of that $45 billion per year in order to license that content in their OVP service locally. So there's no easy answer at the moment to say, okay, we're going to go just digital. We're going to just focus on physical sales and so on. There's much more to lose in the movie industry, and they're much more careful in terms of how they license their content on a global basis because it's so much more expensive. Here I want to talk about really how increased bandwidth on a global basis has led to much more data being transferred over the internet. And this kind of puts things into perspective. This is only taking the internet data from the year 2000 to 2016, where the last 3 years are really forecast from Cisco. We are expected by 2016 to transmit 100 exabytes of data per month globally. An exabyte is 1,000 petabytes or 1,000,000 terabytes. But this increase in transfer of data has led to several dynamics in terms of the ability to send video over the internet and the creation of OTT and OVP services. So let's look a little bit of the history. YouTube launched in 2005. The Blu-ray was actually invented several years earlier, but the first Blu-ray movies were actually released in 2006. Mobile data in 2008 exceeded voice data, so that starts to look into how, from a mobility perspective, the mobile devices started to have the capability of offering more than just basic voice and texting services. Netflix started to stream video, so they went from delivering DVDs to the home to launching a streaming service in the domestic American market. Then in 2009, HTML5 started to become mainstream. So that's allowed for responsive design and providing a platform to port applications to multi-screens, mobile devices, and so on. Apple shipped the iPad in 2010, which is kind of astonishing from my perspective because it seems like these devices have been around forever, but actually it's only been around for 4 years. Then we have Ultraviolet Drm, created in order to have a digital locker of your digital rights management of the content that you buy so that you can watch your movies on different devices and also allow different members of your family to watch that content. So it was one of the first realizations in the industry that we can't just tie our content to one single provider or one single device. People want to watch the content on different devices. 4K started to ship in 2012 and was announced at CES in the US. Then H.265 was finalized, and that fit nicely with 4K. The two will work together in terms of encoding video in the future, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Right now, in 2014, according to YouTube, 100 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. So it's an astonishing amount of video. I want to focus a little bit on where this all kind of began, because OTT is still quite a young market. And I would argue that OTT started around 2006. HD screens started to ship, full HD 1080p screens. The Red One, which was a 4K camera, started to ship. It allowed movie studios to film movies in 4K resolution at a much lower cost compared to film as well. And that completely changed the movie industry. And then Google buys YouTube in around October of 2006. Netflix also ran a contest. They would grant a prize of $1 million to engineers that would find a way to improve their recommendation engine. And this is significant not just for Netflix, but also on a historical basis. Their realization that the better a recommendation engine is, the more revenue they can generate. Because the more people see movies that are good recommendations, then they stay on their platform longer and they enjoy that experience longer. So the recommendation engine concept became quite important to make it as accurate as possible. A lot of companies realize they can use various types of technologies in order to create a platform to deliver video. They saw it on YouTube, they saw Netflix doing it, so why not create a company that can build OTT platforms for anybody around the world? So a lot of the first movers in OTT started around this time frame because of this perfect storm of technologies that were coming together around 2005, 2006. This slide from Cisco takes the data that I was talking about earlier a little bit further in terms of confirming of the 100 exabytes of data that are going to be sent on a global basis per month, how much of it actually is video. And you can see by 2017, 70% of this content will be actually video. It also leads into really the opportunities that we see from an OTT provider in realizing if this is video, then we'll play a big role in offering these services. But we can also look at it from the perspective of the regional split in terms of how different regions are enjoying bandwidth. Mature markets like Western Europe and North America and even Central and Eastern Europe have very high bandwidth already today. But markets such as the Middle East and Africa are still quite low in terms of the amount of bandwidth. It gives you an idea that if we have much less bandwidth in these markets, then the dynamic of how we deliver OTT is different in how we need to service those type of markets. So our strategy changes in terms of the maturity of these markets, and this does relate specifically to the maturity of how OTT is played out because of the bandwidth capabilities in these individual markets. Another thing that we can look at is from a cost perspective. This is a study from the New American Foundation that looked at the top 16 cities that were offering bandwidth at around the $35 per month price point. Not only do we have very good bandwidth on a global basis, but there are selective cities, capital cities in many cases, that have significant bandwidth to deliver very good quality video at a very affordable price. Not only do we have bandwidth growing on a regional basis, but it's also becoming affordable as well. And this also helps in terms of the delivery of video and delivery of OTT solutions and plays into the market space that we're in. So from a strategy perspective, I want to look at OTT from how the market has matured. One of the first movers really in OTT has been the American markets. A lot of the first movers in OTT service providers started in America, and we call that the Tier 1 markets. Then the European markets and Canada and selected parts of Asia are, let's say, 2 years behind the US in terms of OTT evolution. And then we can look at the emerging markets or the developing markets 4 years plus behind the US in terms of OTT developments. The US market, because it's more mature and they've been in this market for many more years, they have many suppliers in the region, and the maturity has resulted in a lot of the Tier 1 broadcasters already using OTT services. But the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 type companies are opportunities that still have not been addressed, and as we move into lower tiers, there are orders of magnitude number of companies that we can address. In looking at the fact that the developing markets are, let's say, 4 years behind the US, it gives the emerging markets an opportunity that when they're looking at what the US are doing today, it's almost kind of looking into what they will be doing in 4 years, right? So there's an opportunity to say, well, if the US are doing this today, then we can even leapfrog. Why wait 4 years? Let's just offer that same technology today in the emerging market and leapfrog other types of providers in that local region. There's kind of like this looking into the future type of capability that plays a role here. Part of looking at the regional markets and understanding who is a developing market and who is, let's say, a developed market. And developing, we're talking about emerging markets. We could look at it from the perspective of how many households are using pay TV services and how much are they being charged on a monthly basis for that pay TV service. Because pay TV is a natural progression into using an online service like OTT. I put this slide together which looks at that dynamic of household penetration to average revenue per user. ARPU is average revenue per user per year. Okay? So you can see that if you're in the lower left quadrant, in that lower area, that's a developing market. And as you move into the top right, you're in a developed market. The sub-Saharan African region has a fairly respectable average revenue per user on a yearly basis, but their house penetration is very low. India, on the other hand, has a lower average revenue per user, but their penetration is quite high, but we still consider them to be an emerging market. And the size of the bubble is a representation of how many households there are. So you can see that there's a lot of opportunity in China, in Russia, in India. Another dynamic is really to kind of take this to another granular level and say, okay, let's look at satellite providers in these regions in terms of penetration. Let's look at cable. In several countries, the cable subscribers is in decline, but satellite subscribers is on the increase. It's looking at really kind of where the data is available in terms of putting together a business case for opportunity. And often we look at neighboring technologies that relate to a similar type of growth path that we would expect based on a neighboring technology. And definitely a neighboring technology is the amount of digital televisions in a country, which is another aspect which hasn't been shown here. And then next level is the amount of pay TV providers or households that are using pay TV, which are typically digital anyway, right? So that's taking it to the next level. And then splitting that out in terms of satellite providers and cable providers. All of that data, I think, is relevant in terms of assessing the market opportunity in OTT, especially if the data is not available. So I talked about the different tiers, and this is a generalization of the type of tiers that we're looking at, because these tier opportunities in terms of the OTT evolution relate to the geographic discussions that I was talking about earlier. If we were to generalize and say tier 1 providers are broadcasters, telcos, and some global companies that are enterprises. Tier 2 are national companies and regional broadcasters, and also some cable operators or telco providers here as well, regional telco operators. And then the tier 3 could be, let's say, online retailers, higher education, government. Then as we move down into these tiers, there are more and more companies that could be potential for buying an OVP or an OTT service. And how we deal with these different tiers really depends on the region that we're looking at. So in the US, as I mentioned before, it may be fair to say that a lot of the tier 1 broadcasters have already invested many years in OTT services. And some of these broadcasters actually have multiple OTT platforms already running within their organization, because different departments had an autonomous ability to buy their own OTT service. And they find themselves 8 years later realizing that they have 10 different OTT services and they need to consolidate in order to save money, for example. So when we're looking at the American markets, then we can look at possibly the tier 1s, but there's more scope in terms of the tier 2s and the tier 3 opportunities. The more we go into the developing markets or the emerging markets like Africa, parts of Asia, or Central and Eastern Europe, there is still a lot of opportunity with the tier 1 broadcasters. Now, we can look at these tiers to another level of detail. When we're talking about enterprise, I mentioned the online retailers and the government organizations, education, and so on. There are media companies like music studios, film studios, those that do freelance for enterprise, those that are in distribution and consolidating of content. Underlying here is the network operators. A lot of these operators, they deliver the video anyway. They're an internet provider, let's say, they're delivering video. Operators are saying to themselves, well, if we're delivering the video, why don't we host it and manage it as well? So it's a logical extension to their communications portfolio, to their communication strategy, to include management and hosting of video services as an extension of their portfolio. So the way I explained it earlier, that we're building Netflixes for companies that want to deliver video entertainment locally, building a Netflix service is a platform as a service. Now, software as a service is similar, except we are owning the platform ourselves. It's sitting in the cloud, and we are allowing clients to pay for storage and bandwidth, upload their videos as a cloud-based service that we own ourselves. This slide really talks about the different market opportunities in terms of platform as a service reaching over $1 billion by 2017, and software as a service, which is a much more mature market, is, let's say, around $26 billion by 2016. We can take this from a different perspective and look at how the market sees OTT grow in the next 3-4 years. And OTT also has very strong market potential to over $37 billion by 2017. The other point I want to make is that even by 2017, OTT being $37 billion, it will still represent just 9% of the overall TV and video market, which is $400 billion. From one side, we're seeing video broadcast on the decline and internet video on the increase, but even in 3-4 years, the broadcast market itself will still be 10 times bigger than the OTT market.